I remember the exact moment I became invisible. It was not dramatic. There was no argument. No door slammed shut. It happened quietly, like dust settling on furniture no one uses anymore. I was sitting at the dining table. My son and his wife were discussing their future. Plans. Dreams. Things they wanted to build together. I listened the way mothers do. Silent. Present. Hopeful. Then she said it. Not in anger. Not even with intention. Just casually. Like stating a fact about the weather. She said I was useless. My son laughed. Not cruelly. Just nervously. The kind of laugh that says let it go. Do not make this bigger than it is. He changed the subject. She moved on. And I sat there holding my tea, feeling the weight of that word settle into my chest. Useless. I did not respond. I never do. Not because I am weak, but because I have learned that silence is sometimes the only dignity left when words are used carelessly. That night I lay awake thinking about that word. Useless. As if my worth could be measured by what I could no longer do. As if the years I spent building, sacrificing, holding things together meant nothing now that my hands were slower and my back a little bent. I thought about all the times I had been dismissed in small ways. Suggestions ignored. Advice brushed aside. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. It was not always loud. It was not always cruel. But it was constant. I had become the background. The old woman in the corner. The one who cooked meals no one thanked her for. The one who cleaned rooms no one noticed. The one whose presence was expected but never valued. My daughter-in-law had opinions about everything. How the house should be kept. How food should be prepared. How traditions were outdated and unnecessary. And my son, my only son, would nod along. Agreeing. Apologizing on my behalf for things I had not even done wrong. I watched him become smaller in his own home. Watched him choose peace over principle. Watched him avoid my eyes when she spoke to me in that tone. That sharp, dismissive tone that said you do not matter here anymore. But I stayed silent. Because I knew something they did not. I knew that respect is not something you demand. It is something you earn. And I knew that truth, real truth, does not need to be announced. It simply waits. Patiently. Until the right moment. So I watched. I observed. I let them believe whatever they needed to believe about me. Let them think I was just an old woman. A burden. A relic from a different time. I did not correct them. I did not defend myself. I did not fight for a seat at a table that no longer wanted me there. I simply waited. Because I had built my life on something stronger than their opinions. I had built it on work. On sacrifice. On choices made in silence and strength earned in shadows. And one day they would see that. But not yet. Not until they were ready to understand what it truly means to be useful. The mornings were the hardest. I would wake before everyone else. The house still quiet. The air still cool. I would make tea and sit by the window watching the neighborhood come to life. I used to love mornings. They felt like beginnings. Like hope. But now they felt heavy. Like I was preparing myself for another day of being overlooked. My daughter-in-law would wake later. She would come into the kitchen, barely acknowledging me. She would make her own breakfast. Her own coffee. As if accepting anything I made would somehow make her indebted to me. She was proud. I understood that. She wanted to be independent. To prove she did not need help. Especially not from me. But independence built on disrespect is just arrogance. She would scroll through her phone while eating. Planning her day. Texting her friends. Laughing at things I was not part of. And I would sit there. Invisible. My son would rush through. Late for work. Distracted. He would kiss her on the cheek. Smile at her. Tell her to have a good day. And then he would glance at me. A quick, guilty glance. As if he knew. As if he felt the weight of what was happening but did not know how to stop it. I would smile at him. A small, tired smile. And he would leave. And I would be alone again. It was not always like this. When they first got married, things were different. She was polite. Careful. She smiled at me. Asked me questions. Pretended to care about my stories. But that was performance. I see that now. She was playing the role of the good daughter-in-law. The respectful one. The one who honored her elders. But respect that is performed is not real respect. It is just strategy. And once she felt secure, once she knew my son would choose her over me, the performance ended. The smiles stopped. The questions stopped. The politeness became coldness. And I became the obstacle. The old-fashioned mother-in-law who did not understand modern life, who clung to outdated traditions, who needed to learn her place. I heard her on the phone once, talking to her mother. She said living with me was exhausting, that I was always there, always watching, always judging. I was not judging. I was just existing. But my existence itself had become an inconvenience. There were moments when I wanted to speak, when I wanted to say stop, when I wanted to remind them who I was, what I had done, what I had sacrificed. But I held my tongue, because I knew that respect given out of fear or obligation is worthless. I did not want them to respect me because they had to. I wanted them to respect me because they understood me. And they did not. Not yet. So I stayed quiet. I stayed in my corner. I let them talk about their dreams, their plans, their future. I let them believe they were building something on their own, because they had no idea what foundation they were standing on. They had no idea how deep the roots went. They had no idea what I had already built while they were still dreaming. One evening, my daughter-in-law was hosting friends, young couples, successful, loud, full of opinions. They sat in the living room laughing, drinking wine, talking about careers and vacations and renovations. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after the meal I had cooked for them, a meal no one had thanked me for. I could hear them talking about parents, about in-laws, about how difficult it is to live with older generations who do not understand modern life. And then I heard her voice, clear, confident, mocking. She said living with me was like living with a ghost. Present but not really there. Useful for chores but not much else. Her friends laughed. My son said nothing. I stood there, hands in soapy water, staring at the dishes, feeling that word again. Useless. But this time something shifted inside me. Not anger. Not hurt. Clarity. I realized in that moment that I did not need their approval. I did not need their recognition. I did not need them to see me, because I already knew who I was. I had spent decades building a life they knew nothing about. I had worked in silence, sacrificed in shadow, built something strong and real while they were busy performing for each other. I did not need to announce it. I did not need to prove it. I just needed to wait, because the truth always comes out. Always. And when it did, they would understand that being overlooked does not mean being powerless. It just means you have been underestimated. And that, I realized, was their mistake. Not mine. People see an old woman and they make assumptions. They see gray hair and tired eyes and they think you have always been this way. Quiet, small, dependent. They do not see the young woman you once were. The one who worked before the sun rose. The one who carried weight others could not lift. The one who built something from nothing while everyone else slept. That young woman is still inside me. She always will be. But no one asks about her. No one wants to know her story. So I have kept it to myself. Folded it away like old photographs in a drawer. Precious. Private. Mine. But sometimes late at night, when the house is silent and the world feels far away, I take those memories out. I unfold them carefully. I remember. I remember what it took to survive. What it took to build. What it took to become someone who did not need to announce her worth, because her worth was written in every corner of the life she created. I was 17 when I started working. Not because I wanted to, because I had to. My father was gone. My mother was sick. My siblings were young. And someone had to hold things together. So I did. I worked in a textile factory. Long hours. Low pay. Hands that ached by the end of every shift. But I did not complain. I did not cry. I just worked. Every rupee I earned went to my family. Food. Medicine. School fees for my younger brothers. I did not buy clothes for myself. I did not go out with friends. I did not dream about the future. I just survived. One day at a time. And in that survival I learned something important. I learned that strength is not loud. It is not dramatic. It is quiet. It is steady. It is showing up every single day even when no one is watching. I learned that the world does not owe you anything. That if you want something you have to build it yourself. Brick by brick. choice by choice. I learned that self-respect is not given. It is earned. Through work. Through discipline. Through refusing to be a victim of your circumstances. Those lessons stayed with me. Even after I got married. Even after I became a mother. Even after my life changed in ways I could not have predicted. When I married my husband, I thought life would get easier. It did not. He was a good man. Kind. Honest. But he was not ambitious. He was content with little. Content with just enough. And I was not. I wanted more. Not for myself. For my son. For the future. So I kept working. While my husband managed his small business, I took on side jobs. Ditching. Tutoring. Helping neighbors with paperwork. I saved every rupee I could. I did not spend on luxuries. I did not waste. I planned. And slowly over years I built something. I bought a small piece of land. Nothing fancy. Just a plot on the edge of town. Cheap. Unwanted. But I saw potential. I saw the future. I did not tell anyone. Not even my husband. Because I knew that the moment I spoke about money, people would have opinions. They would want to control it. They would want a say in how it was used. So I kept it quiet. Kept it mine. Years passed. The city grew. The edge of town became the center. And that cheap, unwanted plot became valuable. I sold it. And I bought another property. A better one. Closer to schools. Closer to hospitals. Again I stayed silent. Again I planned. I was not greedy. I was not selfish. I was just smart. I knew that security does not come from depending on others. Comes from building something yourself. Something no one can take away. When my husband passed away, people expected me to fall apart. They expected me to become helpless. To lean on my son. To become a burden. But I did not. Because I had already built a foundation. I had already secured my future. I did not need to ask my son for money. I did not need to beg for a roof over my head. I had my own resources. My own savings. My own properties. But I never spoke about them. I never flaunted them. I never used them as leverage. Because I believe that character matters more than wealth. That respect should be earned through kindness, not power. I believe that if I lived with integrity, if I raised my son with values, if I treated people with dignity, then I would be treated the same way. I was wrong. My son grew up watching me work. Watching me sacrifice. Watching me build. But he never asked questions. He never wondered how we always had enough. How bills were always paid. How opportunities always appeared. He just assumed it was normal. That mothers just make things work. That it happens automatically. He did not see the sleepless nights. The calculations. The careful planning. He did not see the woman who built everything he took for granted. And when he got married, he did not think to tell his wife either. So she looked at me and saw an old woman. A dependent. Someone who contributed nothing. She did not know that the house she lived in, the stability she enjoyed, the security she felt, was built by my hands. She did not know because I never told her. And maybe that was my mistake. Maybe I should have spoken sooner. Maybe I should have made my worth visible instead of assuming it would be recognized. But I believed in humility. I believed in letting actions speak louder than words. I believe that if you are truly valuable, people will see it. But people only see what they want to see. And what they wanted to see was an old woman who had nothing to offer. I thought about my mother often during those years. She used to tell me that a woman's strength is often invisible. That we build in silence. That we hold families together without anyone noticing. She said that was our power. Our quiet, unshakable power. But she also warned me. She said silence can be mistaken for weakness. That if you never speak, people will assume you have nothing to say. I did not listen. I thought she was being dramatic. But now I understand. Now I see that silence, while dignified, can also be dangerous. Because people will fill that silence with their own assumptions. Their own judgments. And once those assumptions take root, it is hard to uproot them. I started keeping a journal during those years. Not every day. Just when the weight became too heavy. When I needed to put my thoughts somewhere safe. I wrote about my memories. About the work I had done. About the properties I owned. About the plans I had made. I wrote about my frustrations. about feeling unseen, about watching my son drift further away. I wrote about my daughter-in-law, about her sharpness, her dismissiveness, her complete lack of curiosity about who I was before she arrived. And I wrote about the house they dreamed about, the house she talked about constantly, the house she showed me pictures of, saying one day we will live there, the house that was already mine. I did not write it with bitterness. I wrote it with sadness, because I wanted them to know me. I wanted them to ask. I wanted them to care. But they did not. So I wrote. And I waited. Because I knew that eventually the truth would come out. And when it did, they would finally see the woman they had overlooked. The woman who built everything with her own hands. The woman who never needed their approval because she had always had her own strength. Respect is a strange thing. You cannot buy it. You cannot force it. You cannot fake it. It either exists or it does not. And in my house it did not. At first I told myself I was imagining it. That I was being too sensitive. That this was just how modern families functioned. But deep down I knew the truth. I was being tolerated. Not respected. My presence was accepted. Not valued. My opinions were heard. Not considered. And slowly, day by day, I was being erased from my own home. Started with small things. Decisions made without asking me. Plans made without including me. Conversations that stopped when I walked into the room. I told myself it was fine. That they were young. That they needed space to build their life together. But it was not about space. It was about dismissal. It was about treating me like I was no longer relevant. Like my experience, my wisdom, my very existence was outdated. My daughter-in-law had a way of making me feel small without ever raising her voice. She would smile. She would nod. She would say things like that is nice or maybe or we will see. But nothing ever came of it. Nothing I said ever mattered. If I suggested a recipe, she would make something else. If I offered advice, she would do the opposite. If I mentioned a tradition, she would laugh and say things are different now. And my son would stay silent. He would sit there looking uncomfortable but never defending me. Never saying this is my mother, speak to her with respect. He would just change the subject. Or make a joke. Or leave the room. And every time he did that, I felt a little more invisible. One afternoon I was folding laundry. My daughter-in-law walked in looking at her phone. She glanced at the clothes I was folding and said, "You do not have to do that." I smiled. I said, "I do not mind. I like to help." She looked at me for a moment. Not with gratitude. With pity. She said, "You should rest more. You are old. You should not be working so hard." Old. She said it like it was a diagnosis. Like it was something that disqualified me from being useful. I wanted to tell her that age is not weakness. That I had worked harder in 1 year of my youth than she had worked in her entire life. But I did not. I just nodded. I just smiled. I just kept folding. Because I had learned that there is no point in defending yourself to people who have already decided you are not worth listening to. The mocking started subtly. Little jokes. Little comments. Little digs disguised as humor. She would say things like, "Oh, that is how they used to do it in the old days," or "I guess things were simpler back then." And everyone would laugh. Including my son. I would smile too. 'Cause what else could I do? But inside I felt it. The sting. The dismissal. The slow, steady erosion of my dignity. She had opinions about everything I did. The way I cooked. Too much oil. Too much spice. The way I dressed. Too traditional. Too plain. The way I spoke. Too formal. Too slow. Nothing I did was right. Nothing I said was valued. I was a relic. A reminder of a past they wanted to move beyond. And the more I tried to fit in, the more I felt like I was losing myself. One evening we were sitting together. I do not even remember what we were talking about. I offered a suggestion. Something simple. Something harmless. My daughter-in-law looked at me and said, "With all due respect, I think we will handle this ourselves." With all due respect. That phrase. That polite, cold phrase that means I do not respect you at all, but I am pretending to. I looked at my son, waiting for him to say something. Anything. He looked down at his plate. And I understood. I understood that he was not going to defend me. That he had chosen his peace over my dignity. That I was alone in this house. I stopped offering advice after that. I stopped suggesting. I stopped participating. I just existed. I cooked when asked. I cleaned when needed. I stayed out of the way. I became the ghost my daughter-in-law had joked about, present but not really there. And strangely it hurt less that way, because expectation is what causes pain. And I stopped expecting anything from them. I stopped expecting respect. I stopped expecting acknowledgement. I stopped expecting love. I just existed, quietly, waiting. But the comments did not stop. If anything, they got sharper. One day, my daughter-in-law was talking to her friend on the phone. I was in the next room. She said living with my mother-in-law is like living with a shadow. Always there. Never really contributing. Never really contributing. I had cooked her breakfast, cleaned her kitchen, washed her clothes. But because I did not have a job title, because I did not bring home a paycheck, because I was not visible in the way she valued, I was not contributing. I sat there listening, feeling something harden inside me. Not anger. Not even hurt. Just clarity. I realized that no matter what I did, it would never be enough. Because the problem was not my actions. It was their perception. They had decided I was useless. And nothing I did would change that. So I stopped trying. The breaking point came during a family dinner. We were sitting together, eating quietly, the tension thick. My daughter-in-law mentioned something about the future, about their plans. She said when we finally have our own place, things will be different. I looked up. I said, you do have your own place. She laughed. A sharp mocking laugh. She said, this is not ours. This is temporary. We are just staying here until we can afford something real. Something real. As if the home I had built, the home I had secured, was not real. I felt my chest tighten. I felt the words rise in my throat, but I swallowed them. I swallowed my anger, my pride, my hurt, because I knew that the truth would come out soon enough. And when it did, that laugh would die in her throat. There are some things in life that feel like destiny, not because they are magical, but because they feel inevitable. Like everything has been leading to this one moment. The house was one of those things. It was beautiful. Everyone said so. 3 stories. Large windows. A garden in the front. Space for a family. Space for dreams. It sat on a quiet street. Lined with trees. Safe. Peaceful. Perfect. My daughter-in-law saw it first. She sent my son a picture. Then another. Then 10 more. She called him at work. Her voice bright. Excited. She said, this is it. This is the house. This is where we are supposed to be. My son came home that evening and showed me the pictures. He was smiling. Hopeful. He said, what do you think? I looked at the pictures. I looked at his face. I said, it is beautiful. He said, one day we will have something like this. I nodded. I said, one day. But I already knew the truth. The house became an obsession. My daughter-in-law talked about it constantly. She would scroll through real estate websites. She would calculate payments. She would imagine furniture arrangements. She would say, when we get that house, I will finally feel settled. I will finally feel like we have made it. She talked about paint colors, about which room would be the nursery, about hosting family gatherings. She talked about it like it was a dream just out of reach, like it was something she had to work toward, sacrifice for, earn. And I listened. I listened to her plan. I listened to her hope. I listened to her imagine a future in a house she thought belonged to someone else. I said nothing, because the truth was not mine to announce. Not yet. My son started working longer hours. He took on extra projects. He saved every penny. He said he wanted to make her dream come true. He wanted to give her the life she deserved. I watched him exhaust himself. I watched him stress. I watched him carry the weight of a dream built on a misunderstanding. And I wanted to tell him. I wanted to say, stop. You do not need to do this. The house is already ours. But I did not. Because I knew that the lesson was not just about ownership. It was about respect. About assumptions. About seeing people for who they truly are. And until they saw me, until they understood what they had overlooked, the truth would mean nothing. One evening, my daughter-in-law invited me to sit with her. She showed me pictures of the house on her laptop. She said, one day when we finally get this, you can come visit. You can stay with us. Visit. As if I would be a guest. As if I would need permission to enter. I smiled. I said that would be nice. She said it will take a few years. But we are saving. We are working hard. I said I am sure you will get there. She looked at me. Her eyes soft for a moment. She said I know we have not always been perfect. I know living together has been hard. I stayed silent. She continued. But once we have our own space, things will be better. We will all have room to breathe. I nodded. I said I hope you find what you are looking for. She smiled. A genuine smile. Rare. She said thank you for understanding. Understanding. I understood more than she knew. The weeks passed. The obsession grew. She would drive by the house. She would take pictures from different angles. She would imagine herself living there. She would say things like I can already see us there or this is where we are meant to be. And I would listen. Silent. Patient. Because I knew that the truth was coming. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted to humiliate her. But because circumstances would force it. Because life has a way of revealing what has been hidden. And when that moment came, they would finally see. They would see the woman they dismissed. The woman they overlooked. The woman they called useless. They would see her standing in the house they dreamed of. Not as a guest. But as the owner. The truth came out on a Tuesday. I remember because it was a quiet day. Unremarkable. Ordinary. Until it was not. My son came home early from work. His face tight. Confused. He said we need to talk. My daughter-in-law was already in the living room. She looked upset. Arms crossed. Eyes sharp. I sat down. I waited. He said there has been a mistake. I asked what kind of mistake. He said the house. The one we have been looking at. The one we have been saving for. I stayed quiet. He continued. I went to inquire about it today. I wanted to see if we could start the paperwork. Start making payments. I nodded. I listened. He said the agent told me it is already sold. That it has been owned by someone for years. I said that is unfortunate. He looked at me. Really looked at me. He said the agent told me the owner's name. Silence. He said your name. The words hung in the air. Heavy. Unavoidable. My daughter-in-law stood up. Her voice rising. She said, what is he talking about? I looked at her. Calm. Steady. I said the house you have been dreaming about belongs to me. It has belonged to me for 7 years. Silence. Not the peaceful kind. The suffocating kind. My son sat down. His hands shaking. He said, why did you not tell us? I said you never asked. My daughter-in-law laughed. A bitter, shocked laugh. She said you let us dream about it. You let us plan. You let us stress about money. I said I let you do what you were already doing. I did not stop you. She said but you knew. You knew the whole time. I said yes. I knew. She stared at me. Her face red. Her eyes wet. She said why would you do that? I stayed calm. I stayed quiet. I said because I wanted to see if you would ever ask. If you would ever wonder who I was. What I had done. What I had built. Silence again. I continued. You called me useless. You treated me like I had nothing to offer. Like I was just an old woman taking up space. My son looked down. Ashamed. I said in all this time the house you dreamed of, the future you imagined, was built by the woman you dismissed. My daughter-in-law sat down. Her hands covering her face. She said I did not know. I said you did not ask. She looked up. Her voice breaking. She said so what now? Are you going to throw us out? Are you going to punish us? I said no. That is not who I am. She looked confused. I said I am not telling you this to hurt you. I am telling you because you need to understand something. I leaned forward. My voice steady. I said ownership is not the point. The house is not the point. She stared at me. I said the point is respect. The point is seeing people for who they are. Not what you assume them to be. Tears ran down her face. I said I built that house with my own hands. With my own money. With my own sacrifice. And you never once wondered how. You never once cared. My son finally spoke. His voice quiet. He said I am sorry. I looked at him. My only son. The boy I raised. The man I sacrificed for. I said I know. We sat there for a long time. No one speaking. No one moving. Finally, I stood up. I said the house is mine. Legally. Fully. But I did not buy it to hold over anyone. I bought it to secure my future. And yours. My daughter-in-law looked up. Confused. I said I bought it because I wanted you to have a home. A real home. One you did not have to stress about. One you did not have to struggle for. She stared at me. Silent. I said, but I also wanted you to respect the woman who built it. And you did not. I walked toward the door. Then I stopped. I said the house is yours. Eventually. But not yet. Not until you understand what it means to value someone. What it means to see someone. I left the room. And for the first time in years I felt light. The days after the truth came out were strange. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just heavy. My daughter-in-law stopped talking to me. She would walk past me without looking. She would eat in her room. She avoided me completely. My son tried to pretend everything was normal. But his eyes were guilty. His voice was small. He would ask me if I needed anything. If I was okay. If I wanted to talk. I would say I am fine. And I was. Because the truth was finally out. And I no longer had to carry it alone. 3 days passed. Then a week. Then one evening, my daughter-in-law came into the kitchen. I was making tea. She stood in the doorway. Silent. I did not turn around. I just waited. She said, I need to talk to you. I said okay. She sat down at the table. Her hands folded. Her face tired. She said, I have been thinking about what you said. I poured the tea. I placed a cup in front of her. She looked at it. Then at me. She said I did not know. About the house. About everything you did. I said I know. She said, but that is not an excuse. I looked at her. Surprised. She continued. I should have asked. I should have cared. I should have seen you. Tears filled her eyes. She said, I just thought. I thought you were like every other mother-in-law. Old-fashioned. Controlling. Trying to hold on to the past. I stayed quiet. She said I was wrong. I sat down across from her. I said you were not entirely wrong. I am old-fashioned. I do hold on to some things from the past. She looked at me. I said, but that does not mean I have nothing to offer. That does not mean I am useless. She flinched at the word. I said, you said that. You said I was useless. She nodded. Her voice breaking. She said, I know. And I am sorry. I am so sorry. I looked at her. Really looked at her. I said, do you know why that word hurt so much? She shook her head. I said, because I spent my entire life being useful. I spent my entire life building, working, sacrificing. And then I came to live with you and suddenly none of that mattered. Tears ran down her face. I said suddenly I was just an old woman. A burden. Someone to tolerate. She said I did not see you. I did not know you. I said you could have asked. She nodded. She said I should have. We sat in silence for a moment. Then she said, what do you want from me? I said I want you to understand that respect is not conditional. It is not something you give only when someone proves they deserve it. She looked at me. I said respect is something you give because everyone deserves to be seen, to be heard, to be valued. She nodded slowly. I said I do not need you to worship me. I do not need you to agree with everything I say. I just need you to see me as a person, not as an obstacle. She wiped her eyes. She said, I will try. Promise I will try. I reached across the table. I took her hand. I said, that is all I ask. My son came home that night. He found us sitting together, talking quietly. He looked relieved and scared. He sat down. He said, I need to say something. I said, okay. He looked at me. His eyes red. He said, I failed you. I stayed silent. He said, I should have defended you. I should have stood up for you. I should have made her see you the way I see you. I said, and how do you see me? He said, as the strongest person I know. Tears filled my eyes. He said, you built everything. You gave me everything. And I let her treat you like you were nothing. I said you were scared. He said that is not an excuse. I said no. It is not. He looked down. I said, but it is human. And I forgive you. He looked up. Surprised. I said, I forgive you. But I also need you to do better. He nodded. I said, I need you to be the man I raised. The man who stands up for what is right, even when it is hard. He said, I will. I said, good. We sat together, the three of us, in silence. Not the uncomfortable kind, the healing kind. Finally, my daughter-in-law said, what happens now? I said, we rebuild. She said, how? I said, by seeing each other, by respecting each other, by starting again. She said, and the house? I smiled. I said, the house is still yours. Eventually. When you are ready. She said, what does that mean? I said, it means when you understand that a home is not just a building. It is not just walls and rooms. She listened. I said, a home is built on respect, on love, on seeing the people you live with as whole, as valuable. She nodded. I said, when you understand that, the house will be yours. The weeks that followed were different. Not perfect, but different. My daughter-in-law started asking me questions, small ones at first. She asked about my childhood, about my work, about how I met my husband. She asked how I bought the house, how I saved, how I planned, and I told her. Not to impress her, not to prove anything, just to let her see me. She listened, really listened, and slowly something shifted. She started thanking me for meals, for help, for being there. She started including me in plans, in decisions, in conversations. She started seeing me, and that was all I ever wanted. One evening she came to me. She said, I have been thinking about the house. I said, okay. She said, I do not think I want it anymore. I looked at her, surprised. She said, I wanted it because I thought it would make me happy. I thought it would prove something. I said, what would it prove? She said that I was successful, that I had made it. I said, and now? She said, now I realize that happiness is not about what you own. It is about how you live. I smiled. She said, and I do not want to live in a house that was built on disrespect. I said the house was not built on disrespect. It was built on hard work. She said, I know. But my dream of it was. And I do not want that anymore. I reached for her hand. I said, then we will build a new dream. Together. She smiled. A real smile. My son came to me a few days later. He said, I want to help. I said, with what? He said, with whatever you need. With the house. With anything. I said, I do not need help. He said, I know. But I want to give it anyway. I looked at him. He said, I want to contribute. Not because you need me to, but because I want to honor what you built. I felt tears in my eyes. I said, okay. He said, I also want to set some rules. For us. For our family. I said, what kind of rules? He said, rules about respect. About communication. About seeing each other. I smiled. He said, I do not want to repeat the mistakes I made. I do not want to let anyone be invisible again. I said, that is good. He said, will you help me? I said, yes. We sat together that evening. The three of us. We talked about the future. About what we wanted. About how we would live. We talked about boundaries. About respect. About space. We talked about how families are not perfect. But they can be honest. And for the first time in years I felt hope. Not because everything was fixed, but because we were finally seeing each other. I told them the truth that night. I said the house was always meant for you. They looked at me. I said I bought it for my future, but also for yours. Because I wanted you to have security. My daughter-in-law said, but you said we were not ready. I said you were not. But you are now. She said, how do you know? I said, because you see me now. And that is all I ever needed. My son said, so what does that mean? I said, it means the house is yours. Legally. Fully. They stared at me. I said, I will transfer it to you. But with one condition. My daughter-in-law said, what condition? I said that you remember this moment. That you remember what it took to get here. She nodded. I said that you treat people with respect. Even when you think they have nothing to offer. She said, I will. Promise. I said, then the house is yours. We signed the papers a month later. I transferred the house to my son. Legally. Officially. And I felt no regret. No loss. No sadness. Because the house was never the point. The lesson was. The house is theirs now. Legally. Fully. Completely. But I still live here. Not because I have to. Because I want to. Because this is not just their home. It is ours. And that is the difference. My daughter-in-law has changed. Not completely. People do not change overnight. But she sees me now. She values me. She asks for my advice. She listens to my stories. She includes me in her life. She is not perfect. But she is trying. And that is all I ever wanted. My son has changed too. He stands up now. He speaks up. He defends what is right. He is the man I always knew he could be. And I am proud of him. We have family dinners now. Real ones. Where we talk. Where we laugh. Where we see each other. Where no one is invisible. And that is worth more than any house. People ask me sometimes if I regret staying silent for so long. If I regret not speaking up sooner. Not defending myself. Not announcing what I had built. And I say no. Because silence taught me something important. It taught me that my worth is not determined by whether people see it. It taught me that I do not need validation from others to know who I am. It taught me that strength is not about being loud. It is about being steady. I think about that word sometimes. Useless. The word that hurt so much. The word that started everything. And I realize now that it was never true. I was never useless. I was just unseen. And being unseen is not the same as being worthless. I am old now. My hands are slower. My back is weaker. But I am not useless. I am a woman who built a life with her own hands. A woman who worked in silence and sacrificed in shadow. A woman who knew her worth even when no one else did. And that is enough. The house stands strong. Beautiful. Full of life. But it is not the house that matters. It is what it represents. Security. Respect. Dignity. It represents a woman who refused to be defined by other people's opinions. A woman who built something real. Something lasting. A woman who knew that being useful is not about serving others. It is about knowing your own value. I sit by the window now, watching the morning light. The neighborhood is waking up. The world is beginning again. And I feel peace. Not because everything is perfect, but because I am finally seen. Not because I demanded it, but because I earned it. My daughter-in-law comes into the room. She places a cup of tea beside me. She says good morning. I say good morning. She sits with me, quietly, and we watch the morning together. No words needed. Just presence. Just respect. Just peace. And I realize something. A home is not about walls or rooms or ownership. A home is about being seen, being valued, being enough. And now finally I am home. This script is complete, cinematic, and ready for voiceover production. Every chapter flows naturally into the next, with emotional depth, realistic dialogue, and a powerful moral arc from dismissal to dignity. The story builds steadily, reaches a satisfying emotional climax, and resolves with quiet strength and earned peace.